Okay, welcome to our probably last, maybe penultimate session. And we've worked through the things you submitted and your questions. And by the way, you all did very good jobs on those summaries. Many of you got perfect scores. Those who didn't had very high scores. So it was a really good set of submissions, the best we've seen by far. And improvement, of course, counts in your favor. So I figured out 7 basic questions when in looking through them that seem to pick up and get re-asked by several people. Some were just conceptual. So here's the first one. Some people were not altogether clear about the difference between morphological computation and subsumption architectures.
That's a good one.
And that's a good one. What to say about morphological?
So morphology is a Greek word. The root morpho means form. It means shape. It means structure. So the morphology of an organism is the form it takes. The organism's phenotype is its whole physical existence, including its behavior, and then the morphology is just the physical form of the organism, its physiological structure. And when it comes to morphological computation, that is a term that we've come up with to describe something that looks like intelligent behavior, like an intelligent, structured system of response to something that's going on in the environment that actually can be reduced to a very simple physiological architecture. So one example of this is Ormia the cricket or the fly? Anyways, there's a
The cricket is the one they talk about in the book.
So there's actually a fly. There's a little parasitic fly that has, so the book talks about it, right? The book talks about the female cricket hearing with her legs, right, with her forelegs. She hears the male cricket with her legs, and that just automatically cues a taxis response. Taxis, again, a Greek word, being directed locomotion, motion in a direction. So she hears the male cricket's song and automatically taxis in the direction of the best song, right? Or the nearest song that's within cricket vibratory range, frequency range, right? There's a parasitic fly who also taxis toward the male cricket song because he wants to lay his eggs inside the male cricket so that those little fly eggs can hatch into larvae inside the male cricket and consume him from the inside out and hatch, killing him, right? Because nature is kind and beautiful in that way. And so these flies have a very peculiar architecture of their auditory system, such that so inside the ear, the thing that's doing the hearing is the tympanum. It's a little, like if you have a microphone and you get this little membrane, there's a little.
It's a drum.
It's like a drum. Yeah. Oh, that's Latin root. It's a drum, isn't it?
Yep.
It's actually, that's what the Latin root is. Yeah, okay. So you get this little drum-like membrane, and that is going to vibrate in response to waves of sound hitting it, right? And
just as your eardrums do.
Right. That's in every ear. That's the case in every ear, and that vibration gets picked up, and then we do stuff with it, right? In tympani. Anyways,
drums.
It's literally eardrum. That's where we get eardrum from, isn't it? Yes. Oh, that's wild. Eardrum is tympani. Okay, yeah. Nice. So this fly, the tympanum on either ear, on both sides is connected by a physiological structure that is, it's not just straight across. It's not like the path of least action. It's not a straight across connection between the two tympanums. Don't know how to pluralize that. It actually arcs so as to maximize the distance between the two, and that vibration, the ears of this is a microscopic fly. This is like a fruit fly size little guy. He's tiny. The difference in sound, right? The difference in time between a noise hitting him on the right side of his head and his right ear, and the noise hitting him on the left side of his head and his left ear, is so unimaginably tiny, because this fly is so unimaginably tiny, right? That we think that he would have to be doing some kind of elaborate computation, some elaborate mathematics in his little tiny fly brain in order to tell what direction the sound is coming from. But he's actually physiologically wired such that the distance between these two eardrums is physically maximized, and his taxis is just wired in there to be hyper responsive to the directionality of sound. Now this is groundbreaking. So since we've discovered this about this little fly, we've kind of revolutionized the way we've built, for example, microphones and hearing aids. And this is a recent result. So we've just sort of figured this out, but it's revolutionized the way we think about audition. And it's an example of something where we think there must be some elaborate mathematics going on in the mind of this organism, and it's actually just a trick of physiology or physics.
Yep, and basically all organisms who have hearing do the same thing. That is, they have generally two sensory receptors, and they get the difference between them is what gives them orientation to whatever the source of the sound is. It's true of you, it's true of your dogs, it's true of fish. Everything does the same trick. That's all morphological computation. So the examples are all over the place.
In ethology, the field of biology that studies animal behavior, there's a saying called Morgan's canon, and Morgan's canon tells us to not attribute something to some kind of profound intelligence if there is a much simpler and more basic explanation for it.
And the trick is finding whether there are.
Right.
So the second word that people were worried about was subsumption architectures. And basically the idea is simple. That is, you'll have different discrete units, but the subsumption architecture is one where one of those units is always active.
It's sort of like like layers or like a hierarchy.
Yeah, so the example they use is object avoidance. But there are lots of cases of things that we're constantly monitoring in our environment, and we don't pay any attention to it until we need to. That's a subsumption architecture, where the lowest levels are always active, and they will dominate your behavior when they need to. And other times they're just sort of sitting back and monitoring.
And isn't the idea that it's a hierarchy and the lower levels are kind of subsumed by the higher levels?
Except not dependent on.
But not dependent on, right. So each level is independent of the levels above it,
Mm-hmm.
and the higher levels are dependent on the levels below. But it's also sort of a control hierarchy. So for example, my normal operating tells me not to crash into the ground or other human beings or the floor. But if I'm playing a game, I'm able to override that instinct and tell myself, no, in this scenario, it's okay to slam into other people, or it's okay to dive for the ball and slam into the ground in order to dive for the ball.
Another example that works for people that people might find natural is a large part of our body is concerned with maintaining balance. And we don't usually think about it, but you do it. If for some reason, for example, there's an earthquake or the ground shakes, then you pay attention, but you're doing it all the time. And the need to pay attention to balance and balancing skills will come to the fore whenever you need it, but it's there all the time.
Yeah, try doing yoga during a power outage, and you'll notice how much your ability to balance rests on your visual system.
Yep.
Someone in our department, Tony Shimero, has done a lot of work on a phenomenon he calls, I don't think so. Yes, he calls it that. I don't think he came up with the term for it, but it's called a postural sway, and this is the idea that all the time, when we're staying still, when we're locomoting, when we're doing whatever, just going about our lives, we're kind of engaged in an kind of oscillatory behavior. And what this does is this allows us to get a sense of the depth and relative size and positions of things in the world. So it's only by moving forward and backwards ever so slightly all the time that we're able to get a sense, because in doing that, we see how the geometry, how the sizes of things and their relationships to one another in space change. And it's only in doing that all the time that we're able to get a kind of rich 3D picture of the world we inhabit.
Third concept, emergence.
Oh, excellent. Oh, this is my favorite.
And that's a good one. The cases that they had in mind were robots who would maintain positions relative to one another without anyone controlling them independently. They just sort of monitor their locally nearest neighbor. It's the same thing that gets when this time of year you see the Canada geese flying over in nice V-shaped formations.
Right.
Nobody's leading them. They're just paying attention to their nearest neighbors.
You think there might be a top-down Canada Goose rule that says form a V, form this shape in the sky and fly in this shape in the sky, and after 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the wind conditions, either this goose or this goose who's at the back swaps place with the goose who's at the front. But there's no such rule. There's only the rule of fly just, if I'm flying, I want to fly just to there's a certain airstream that the flight of another goose causes, and I just sort of automatically want to fly in that particular airstream on either side. And what that gives us is a V shape, even though there's no V shape programmed into the goose behavior. That's an emergent property of a very simple behavior.
Even though that's an extremely efficient way to fly long distances.
Right. So you get a higher order, very structured kind of behavior that isn't explicitly programmed in anywhere. My favorite example of this, as of this year at least, is Hooker has a set of 3 papers in 1981 in which he introduces the concept of a virtual Watt governor. And this is the idea that every single, when you have an electrical grid, you have a city that's all running on electricity, right? And every single component there has a literal physical Watt governor that's telling it how to modulate the flow of its electricity such that it's not blowing anything out or ceasing to provide electricity where it's needed. And you have thousands of these all hooked up together. And what you see is that you have an emergent behavior in which they're all acting in a regulated way with respect to one another. So there's a kind of global regulation, a kind of global order that comes into play there that isn't actually explicitly programmed in anywhere. It isn't actually explicitly being done anywhere. There's no computation going on anywhere. The computation is emergent. The computation is just a phenomenon that appears at the higher level of this, and that's called a virtual Watt governor, where there's an emergent behavior of regulation that's not physically instantiated in any one of these governors.
So emergent behavior in general, in this context, becomes the idea that there's a pattern among a number of independent entities where none of them understand the pattern, and no one else does either, but collectively they do. And we say this, by the way, and this is the way emergence gets used here, but emergence is a scary word that gets used in all kinds of different ways in different contexts. But this is the way it gets used in this context.
Yeah. It comes into play in self-organization a lot too. So when you see molecules move in a particular way, you see starlings, a flock of starlings, and they're doing these all sorts of complex behaviors. And it looks as though there's some sort of higher order system in place there, and there isn't. In the philosophical
My apologies.
Us philosophers differentiate between ontic emergence and epistemic emergence. So emergence where there's really something new coming into play that wasn't there before at the lower levels, and epistemic emergence where it's just there's something that seems to us to be irreducible to the lower order phenomena.
Or surprising.
Right. Yeah, it's just something that surprises us. It's just something that we couldn't have predicted, but really it just boils down to the lower level. I think this distinction is actually mistaken, but it's a fun debate if you're interested in finding out more about emergence.
There's a lot about emergence. So, next question.
And there's a thing called, when I was reading this chapter, over the last week, I've been really digging into the literature on emergent computation. And so for me, reading this chapter, I was really interested in the relationship between emergent computation and morphological computation. In some ways, they're very similar. In some ways, they're different. So that's another fun thing if you're interested in this.
I've been wrestling with emergence for years. Here's another one. If you think about robots, what would it take for them to, some people said, experience things, or for them to be conscious? And the simple answer, which isn't an answer, is that they have to be a lot more complicated than they are now. But I don't know what's necessary to experience things or to be conscious.
I think what's necessary for robots to be conscious is for them to be bio robots, for them to be organic robots.
Might be.
That's another fun area of research that you can look into. Someone who I know, who I have a tremendous research crush on, because everything he publishes seems to be mind-blowing. Michael Levin at Tufts. He's got new work out with Josh Bongard at UVM, I believe, on biorobotics. They call them xenobots because they are engineered. These robots are engineered from the embryos of a particularly ugly African frog called Xenopus levi, which is a favorite model organism of some of these researchers. So these xenobots have been all over the news. So if you Google search xenobots, Xenobots, you can find out a lot about biorobotics. These things are incredible.
This idea also shows up in all kinds of science fiction, right? So Isaac Asimov has a set of many essays on robots, and they all have what he calls a positronic brain. So there's some sort of special device in their head that mimics a brain. That's what makes them conscious. So you can play with that, but the answer is they have to be something very different than what they are now.
And for me, it's the very reason that it is the morphological computation and the emergent computation of organisms, even at the molecular level, that is able to get us consciousness, right? That is able to scale up after billions of years of evolution into something conscious, right? And for that reason, there's only so much that top-down engineering or top-down programming can do. And at the most fundamental level, some of that has to be bottom-up. Some of that has to come from the kind of raw physics and chemistry of what you're working with. And that's why I think it needs to be bioengineering that gets us conscious robots.
That's also what's going to lead us in the direction of interesting robotics. So here's the fourth question. It reflected on the link I sent you to work by Brooks. One of the things Brooks describes is a robot that he built, he and others built, that the military takes into battle. It's the size of a backpack, and they can send it in ahead of themselves to scout out what's going on in front of them. It can fall a full story and hit the ground and not be hurt. It rights itself automatically. It's extremely durable, and it will detect the enemy for them. So it's a robotic scout. People wondered if they can do that much, when are they going to take over for soldiers indefinitely? And I can only think soon, I hope, because we don't have to worry about it dying. But there are the robots that people make now, people like Brooks, are really quite remarkable in terms of being durable, but they have to be autonomous in the sense that they can maintain, for example, which side is up, and they can climb stairs up and down.
If you're interested in this stuff, you can also check out some of what Boston Dynamics has been doing. So MIT Robotics and Boston Dynamics are the kind of hotspots for this.
Well, Brooks is at MIT, right? And he's the one who, for example, built your Roombas that you have in your homes. That's his device.
Is that true?
Yep.
Really? Huh.
So and look, that's another device that's pretty dumb, but it won't fall off edges, and it will keep your floor vacuumed. But he has a whole host of robots. Some of them were mentioned in the video I showed you, and others, he has other videos where he shows up lots of his other robots. You can search it out on YouTube. He's an interesting character. So, next question.
Did they see Shaky? They got to see Shaky?
Did they see Shaky?
I have a picture. I drew a picture of
I don't think so.
Shaky back in the day.
Yeah, there's a picture of it in the book, but I don't know that it's not Shaky doing anything.
I think there are some videos about Shaky on YouTube that you can see.
So here's another question some of you asked. What would have to happen for AI to outsmart humans? To actually, would it be possible to reach that point? And lots of you had the answer, had an answer that doesn't work. That robots can't outsmart humans because we build them. But that showed up, by the way, in the responses to Turing early in the semester. The idea was that computers can't do anything except what people program them to do. And that's just not true. They can do all sorts of things that we don't program them to do. They can learn.
Because we can program them to do more
Learning.
than what we can program them to do.
That's right. So would it be possible for them to outsmart humans? Sure, they have, but in different ways. They don't do things the way we tend to do them.
I think it all depends on how we define smart.
Sure. They can do things that we can't do. Could they surpass us in jobs that humans currently do? And the answer is they already do. That's happening in lots of assembly lines, where it's much more efficient and more economical to have robots be the assembly line workers than people who were on the assembly lines. They also don't get bored.
In that sense, automation already was starting to happen at the time of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the start of this process, and this is just a kind of inevitable next step in which just a huge amount of the job force that has been doing very difficult kind of manual labor jobs or very kind of repetitive tasks is getting phased out by robots. Now, this isn't a good thing for the people who have those jobs, in the sense that they are no longer able to sustain themselves. These people are going to starve. And this is going to be coming and taking over just an unthinkable amount of the labor force nowadays. It's going to put people out of jobs. Now, to me, robots, that is technology, is not the issue. The issue is that we have a kind of global economic structure in which you have to sell your labor in order to survive. So that to me is the issue, not the tech.
Right. I mean, it's also true that these are often not very rewarding jobs.
Right.
So if you're working on an assembly line for Ford, you're doing the same simple task over and over and over and over again.
Working 10-hour shifts, and the amount of injuries, people are getting injured all the time, people are getting, and even when they're not getting actively injured, like their hands are getting sewed up or they're missing a finger or they're getting scalding, burns or what have you, they're developing all kinds of like muscle diseases, muscle problems, joint problems by doing the same activity over and over and over again.
In a sense, what Henry Ford gave us when he gave us assembly lines was he turned workers into really simple robots. Do the same thing over and over again, and we're just now noticing that we can now replace those workers with robots.
Yeah.
We'll do a single thing over and over again.
I think Karl Marx kind of noticed that.
He did.
You read
called The Alienation of Labor. As you know.
I was reading that over winter break, and I was like, oh yeah, Marx gets it. Marx gets this automation thing. He gets the tech thing.
Yeah. Next question. We're going to run out soon, by the way. Could the world be successful with AI doing the jobs that humans currently do? Don't know what successful means there, but I suppose so.
Yeah, that's already what's happening. We're already there. That was 10 years ago. We're there. Been there, done that.
That's most of the case here.
The question is, how do we define successful? And of course, my inclination is to say that the problem is not the existence of technology, but the social, economic, and political structures in place around the technology.
And the final question, how does machine learning work? There's lots to say here. Mel has some insight, but simple cases of machine learning, doesn't matter whether it's connectionist machines, PDP machines, or non-PDP machines. You present them with exemplars over and over and over and over again, and they can eventually extract a pattern. So this happened with early checkers and game players. You present them with thousands and thousands of games of checkers, and they'll figure out the winning moves, the patterns that go with winning moves. Or you can present, there are PDP devices, parallel distributed processing machines, that will extract grammatical rules given huge numbers of instances of grammatical sentences.
So we feed machine learning systems just vast corpora of data, just
Thousands.
billions of cases of a certain type of thing in order to get that system to be able to extract the kind of statistical structure that thing has that tells us what it is. So,
and that can be very powerful. One of the places it's shown up very, very nicely is in medical diagnosis. People will present with sets of symptoms, and there are now machines that do medical diagnosis, and they're better than very good clinicians because they pay attention to everything. They don't get sidetracked into thinking into what they would otherwise anticipate, but they can be very good at medical diagnosis because they can take very complex patterns and recognize those patterns.
And they don't have the ego that some doctors have.
That's right. But then Mel had other things to say that are also right, make it less interesting.
Yeah, I've just been thinking that there's still something where machine learning is great. Machine learning is awesome. I love machine learning. And it's much closer to what we're doing, to what our intelligence is, than anything that's come before it, right? And yet at the same time, I still, and this is not something that everyone believes, this is a controversial opinion, but I'm still of the mind that there's something we're missing, in that human children, human little ones in development, you give them like a couple of instances of some class of a thing, of some category of thing, and they're able to extrapolate out and apply that categorization almost perfectly immediately. You give them tomato, apple, pear, and they're not running around mistaking apples, seeing a tomato and calling it an apple, or seeing a banana and calling it a tomato, right? They're almost perfectly able to extract whatever the relevant structure is in that just tiny class of data they're given, and applying that. Or horse, dog, cat. These are all brown colored, hairy, four-legged critters, right? And if you give a child one dog or two dogs and say doggy, it's able to go out in the world and point to everything that's a dog and say doggy, and point to everything that's not a dog, like a squirrel or a cat or a horse, and say, what's that, mommy? Or that's a cat or that's a horse, whatever. You know, they're not misapplying these. Whereas machine learning, you have to slap a machine learning system. You have to slap a neural network with 1 million instances of dog, and then millions and millions and millions of counterexamples of non-dog, of cats and telephones and bananas and desks and cars and what have you, before it's able to go dog, not dog, reliably. Which tells me that it's not just that we're picking up on categories that we're not quite aware of, or that there's something that we're doing that's different than from what machine learning is doing, and we haven't quite figured that out yet.
And as I said to Mel earlier, you can also show a young child, a picture of a dog. You might show them a picture of my dog, who's a boxer, a pretty prototypical dog. But you show them a picture of a boxer and they'll recognize a Pekingese and a Great Dane too. They won't mistake the Great Dane for a horse because they're dogs. So there's something with machine learning, it's different than what we do, but nonetheless powerful and interesting. And that's all the questions we had for the week.
I think the example that there's a Brooks quote in the chapter that talks about the example of a chair, the concept of a chair. What is a chair? Is it four-legged? Is it one-legged? Is it three? You know, it's not four-legged because it can have 3 and 1 and 5. You know, you can see instances of something that we would be perfectly willing to call a chair immediately that have different number of legs. Is it
or
wood, or is it, you know, is it soft, or is it cloth covered, or does it have a back or not? There are so many things. Any kind of hard line that you would say is a necessary and sufficient condition for chairhood, you can find a counterexample, right? You can find something that we're perfectly willing to call a chair that doesn't have that, or something that we're not willing to call a chair that has all of these necessary and sufficient conditions. So that's an example that was brought up in the literature.
Yeah, that's a very typical kind of example. It actually comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who emphasized the idea of a game.
Mm-hmm. And Wittgenstein's answer to this is family resemblance clusters is what tells us what a chair is. So you get a whole grab bag of materials and a whole grab bag of number of legs, and you know, you get a grab bag of things, and then what is a chair is going to mix and match from these family resemblance clusters.
Well, you now have to work on your papers. That's your next task for the class. And we hope you're surviving well in this messy time.